Alright, I think we're good. So, without further ado, I would like to invite the first speaker of the affirming team to the floor.
Are handing massively important environmental projects to a local council that has no resources and no incentive to actually care about these projects. We're happy to hand that power over to the government that we think will do a far better job. What am I going to be doing in this speech? Firstly, on setup, and I think we have two win conditions in this debate. Firstly, we're going to prove to you why we get better speed in terms of projects, but secondly, we're going to prove to you why we actually get better structural outcomes like what negating can give us. Firstly then, on setup, a couple things to know. Firstly, we think that in the status quo, local councils have no incentive to organically improve climate infrastructure organically. Why is this the case? We're going to talk to you later down the line, but firstly, just stuff like demographics and pandering to voters, but also just like having no accountability in the same way that government does. We're going to prove to you later down in the speech why that's true. But furthermore then, note in the status quo, you get less infrastructure under their side because it takes so long to get projects approved, because you have stuff like bureaucratic backlogs. That means that you support, you submit a report to get a project approved in 2023, you get a big fat no in 2025. So we get that cost efficiency under their side. We support under our side giving power to cabinet in order to get more efficient legislation and better legislation passed. We think what NEG has to defend is a system that fails in the status quo. First point then on urgency. At the top of this point, note really quickly that New Zealand hasn't built any large environmental projects within the last decade. What changed on our side then? We think firstly, you get better speed on our side. Why is it the case? Firstly, because governments just have better infrastructure, that means that they have better logging systems and better capital to process requests, to process these projects, right? We think that means you have better access to secretaries that will file reports for you rather than a bunch of local council members sitting around a room sorting through 40 projects, and that is that's why we get better speed. But then, secondly, why don't we get trade-offs on our side for quality? We think this for a couple of reasons. Firstly, because unlike local councils, cabinets have experience dealing with environmental and national issues. That means they have a level of expertise that council members that just run for council don't necessarily have. Secondly then, we think that governments have better access to scholars and a wide network of information that local councils do not have. That means that they're able to consult Māori scholars on iwi issues or land issues that you don't otherwise get from local councils. But thirdly then, and this is the most important one, they have an incentive to do a good job. That means that you scrutinize the government in a way that you don't with local councils. That means that you hold them accountable. That means that they actually have active incentive to care. We think the bottom line here is that you're actually more likely to get better projects on our side because now governments actually care about these projects. What are the impacts of this point? Firstly, on project costs. We think on our side, what the likelihood is you're going to get 3 or 4 more projects passed every year. Let's be crystal clear in this debate. Governments have an incentive to take their do a good job with reviewing these projects. Why is the case? Firstly, on elections, it's voter base, right? They're held accountable through elections. But secondly, the fact that they're dealing with multi-million-dollar projects means that they're probably able to care about these projects more. No, on the comparative, you don't have those systems of accountability for local councils when they can do whatever they want, they just pass whatever councils they want. We think what this means, and you're not likely to trade off quality on our side, because you're likely to, but furthermore then, we're likely to get more projects in the status quo. Why should you care about that then? Because note in the status quo, not enough is being done in terms of the environment, right? That looks like you're getting you're not getting any more environmental projects, and New Zealand's still having a heavy reliance on fossil fuels. We think that what you get on our side, you get more projects. When you get better projects, that you get a greater reliance on renewable energy. Why is this important? Firstly, on culture. We think on the metric of long-termism, we think that you're unlikely, it's unlikely in the status quo when you don't have any renewable power sources, that the country is going to shift to those power sources. And then when you have, given that fossil fuel is finite, given that oil prices are volatile and they have detrimental impacts on stuff like international relations, then it's far better on our side to cushion the government by shifting focus as a country to renewable energy. Secondly then, we think just on the fact that the environmental issue is a globally recognized issue and it's super urgent, we think that as quickly as we can reduce CO2 emissions, as quickly as we reduce the production of fossil fuels, that is a good thing in and of itself. We think in this debate we can win on this alone. Because no matter what NEG brings out, we think that we get a better speed of project review. We think that we get a better speed of project passing on our side. That means you get more projects built. We think that means that you get more environmental improvements on our side. You get the reduction of CO2. We claim all those benefits on the side. Firstly, before I move on, I'll take a point.
Ministers are unlikely to listen to experts due to severe disconnection from local communities and personal re-elective incentives. Why are the rapidly produced technologies likely to be useful for said communities that they have disconnected
Okay,
from?
firstly, we give you a couple reasons for this. Firstly, they have access to a wide network of scholars, right? Like they have a wide, like they have like Māori scholars of like that have expertise in local iwi issues. They have access to those kinds of people. But furthermore, then we told you that governments aren't just going to carelessly pass projects, right? They're actually like they have incentive to actually sit down, consider the implications, consider what this means for the people in the communities. We think that that doesn't go away on our side. That's why we win. Second point then on why we get structurally better outcomes. Why is cabinet exclusively better on our side? We think for a couple reasons. Firstly, on the vulnerable actors, that is to say Māori, like Māori iwi. Note on their side, local councils Māori have no political capital. That's for a number of reasons. Firstly, because they don't advertise local elections very well. That means that Māori people don't usually vote. And furthermore, then, you just have really, really low voter turnout in local elections. People don't really care about who's on your council, but they care who's in government. Secondly, then, you get no like representation in councils insofar as there is a lower population count in these regions. We think the bottom line is there are structural reasons why you don't get the representation of Māori citizens. Compare that to cabinet. The advancement of Māori seats sends people to cabinet. We think that you see that in examples like Tama Potaka, when he went from a Māori MP into cabinet. We think that what that means is that there is an avenue, and a streamlined avenue, for Māori people to get into that cabinet. We think secondly then, on media, you will scrutinize the Beehive if they do bad things to your iwi, but you will scrutinize the Beehive in case they do bad projects. We think compare that to local councils, they're not going to get any like similar level of accountability on their side. Fourthly then, on demographics, we think just like in the vast majority of cases, regions are majority white, the council is majority white, we think that we get better representation on our side. The bottom line of this is that I've proven to you why we have capacity and incentive to exploit Māori. Now I'm going to prove likelihood. Note here that when you have a white demographic in the vast majority of regions, your council is going to majority white. See the reasons above. The problem is then, as a white council, when you have the issue between the environment and indigenous rights, you're going to pander to the environment because you know that voters care about the environment more because it strikes closer to home. You know that this is exasperated because the majority of councils are going broke, right? They have active incentive to pander to their voters. Now what that means is that there's active reasons for them to find loopholes and do a bad job of improving these projects. Why? Okay, so what is the best case scenario for NIC? That means that you're going to get an underdeveloped report submitted to the council. That means you're going to approve this council, you're going to approve the project, but nothing happens. But in the worst case scenario for NIC, companies have incentive to build these projects, right? That means that you're going to displace Māori people, you're going to entrench on burial and sacred sites, you're going to charge exploitative, for example, you're going to have Fletcher buying land for incredibly cheap prices. That means that the government has active incentive to stop this. You get those harms in the local council. Let's ground that then. We think that when you contend with a high likelihood to exploit the vulnerable, weigh that to any short-term loss that side opposition wants to bring out. I think that in either world, you are going to get the exploitation of Māori citizens insofar as you don't have accountability. I think on just the principle of reparations, but also just on a death metric, we win on that. But furthermore then, on the comparative, we think that you don't get any of those benefits on their side. I think the bottom line is we get structurally better outcomes because governments have more capital, they have more incentive, they have more resources to actually be better. They have they have incentive to stop projects that are being exploited. They have better incentive and better capacity to converse with communities better. We think that even if you don't buy our material in urgency, that is to say the speed in which projects get made, we think that you should pound for pound, we get better projects being passed because governments have the ability to actually look at these projects properly. We win on quality as well. It's on that basis we are very proud to propose.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Now the powers that be are telling me that I have to check the health of the stream, so I'm going to do that first. So just chill out for 2 seconds. Alright, apologies for the delay. I would now like to welcome up the first speaker of the negating team.
I don't think Affirmative can come out here and claim that they're going to get a lot of benefits from Māori individuals when they're able to get more, like, when they're less disenfranchised on our side of the house. When the three ministers they're defending are Shane Jones, Chris Bishop, and Simeon Brown. These individuals are people who actively discriminate against these individuals. These are people who actively disregard the need to care about the Treaty of Waitangi. I think the point at which these people are given strict solo control over these resources, I think that's the point at which we've won this debate. Two things I'm going to talk about. Firstly, about why Affirmative gets significantly, immediate environmental harms. Secondly, about why there are large harms for Māori people on their side. But before that, I want to do some setup, and first a clarification. Note then, this debate is not about legislation, nor is it about the ability to actually get, the ability to actually start these projects. This debate is strictly about the ability to collect the resources needed to start. The reason that matters is because they can't assume that resources just come out of nowhere. Resources need to be mined out, they need to be taken from forest. I think that's the point at which they need to engage with this idea that it's not strictly about the ability to run these projects, it's just about resources, right? Okay, on setup, two things. Firstly, what does fast track approvals look like? Firstly, it's about what ministers that are likely to be chosen. Noting that within these governments, it's probably going to be ministers of things like infrastructure. This looks like Chris Bishop, Minister for Housing. It looks like Simeon Brown, who's Minister for Transport. I think the reason they have incentives to ensure that there's doing, because the fast track approvals bill intrinsically is about having infrastructure happen faster. I think the point at which that happened, that's true, is the reasons why these governments are likely to prioritize having ministers that are for infrastructure. Noting that these ministers need to appeal to voters in the short-term election cycle. It means that they have to care about certain things. It means that these ministers who are strictly about increasing housing need to care about these issues. I think the point at which these individuals need to care about they also need, with the point at which these individuals need to care about things like immediate climate issues, such as just building a lot of dams. I think that's the problem, that's the point at which they care less about the issues we're going to talk about. But second, about the incentives for local councils. First is about who local councils are made up of. I think they gave us really poor characterization on that front. Noting that local councils are made up of people from within the community, noting that they're also made up of individuals within local iwi. That is to say that they're often voted in, right? Noting this response to their point about accountability, because their whole point was premised on this idea that local councils aren't voted in and hence have no accountability. Honestly, local councils tend to be voted in. I think the point at which you have an area that has a lot of Māori people, they're probably going to vote in more Māori people to be on that local council. I think that's the point at which they're able to actually get more representation, right? Secondly, though, is that local councils are going to care about these projects for two reasons. First is that people just broadly care about renewable energy, right? But second is that they carry a lot of local benefits to have renewable energy. That is to say that if you have a local wind farm, you're probably going to have a lot of benefits to your local community. That is to say that even if the approvals process does take longer, they're probably still going to happen in the long term, insofar as they just have incentives to ensure that that happens. Noting that their response to that material about getting these projects across in the first place, we think is likely going to happen insofar as there are incentives to ensure that they do happen. I think that matters. Okay. So, why does Affirmative get significant immediate environmental harm? The context of this point is that many of these projects do require a significant amount of resources. This looks like how building dams requires a load of concrete, or how wind farms require large areas of land that have no trees, that probably just doesn't exist as much in New Zealand.
On that.
So, why does Affirmative have a lot of immediate harm? Three reasons. First is that ministers have poor cost-benefit analysis specifically for environmental projects. That is to say, they're often very biased as individuals because they just aren't very educated overall. But second, note that they often don't know a lot about the environmental issues as a whole. That is to say that when these ministers are ministers for transport, they probably don't know a lot about it. They probably don't have they probably just don't have knowledge overall. But the third under this is that Fast Track has the capacity to let managers just reject and disregard advice. That is, when they have to cater for their voters, they probably don't have to care that much about the specific advice given by these expert panels. Noting comparatively what we have on our side is a local council that is made up of these experts that are probably more binding insofar as they're just more directly accountable to their local community. I think that's the point at which we have these individuals who need to listen to advice. We probably have better outcomes there. Second reason though is that ministers often have other incentives that mean they care less about the environment. That is, they need to cater for a voter base that's probably themselves less educated about the environment. But second, they often just have a lot of unnuanced takes about what matters within the environment. It looks like how they often care a lot about just the global climate change rather than just small environmental issues that impact people probably in a significantly higher way. I'll talk about that later. Third though is that ministers are often disconnected from local communities. They're often not engaged with local communities, right? What is the comparative then? First, I already talked about how we're going to have they're going to be bounded to the advice they're given. But secondly, they're just significantly more connected to local communities insofar as it's just made up of people from within them. Third thing is they're probably going to have a more broad range of knowledge insofar as it's just many people rather than just three ministers dictating literally everything. I think that's the point at which we have more advice given to these individuals that mean they're going to make smarter choices. The impacts of this point are twofold. Firstly, there's going to be a significant risk for ecological disaster on their side of the house, insofar as there's large mining things that the ministers probably just don't care about that much. That is that when you have large mining projects, I think that disrupts local environments in significant ways that impacts like the animals living there, for example. Also, it impacts like the individuals living there, insofar as the kinds of mining that gets happened means that there's going to be less clean water around those areas. I think that really matters for people's daily lives. But also, there's significant long-term environmental harms. That is to say that when they do impact a lot of mining, that literally makes the earth less stable, right? I think the point at which there's just significant amounts of mining overall, the point is that the point is when these ministers are more incentivized to just let these through without adequate consideration of what actually happens, that's the point at which we have a lot of harm. Okay, I'm going to quickly just mitigate all of their material about environmental benefits, right? Noting that their environmental benefits are predicated on this idea that global climate change is a very big deal, and that this have like global warming because of a lot of carbon emissions is a really big deal. I already explained to you why they're likely to get those benefits in the first place. Noting the only way metric they can give on that then is about the urgency required. Noting that this 2 years probably doesn't matter as much, and if we have significant environmental harms from things like mining, from things like deforestation for wind farms, it's probably going to be significantly larger and significantly more detrimental for the environment, insofar as we're still able to get our projects out in the long term. That means we should weigh this point on twofold. Firstly, about the severity on which it impacts people. I think it's incredibly severe insofar as the environment is literally collapsing, the point at which we're deforesting large areas. But the second is that it's logically prior, right? That is, if they care about the environment in the long term, the point at which we necessarily have to destroy the environment to get those resources is, I think, the point at which we win this. Before I move on, I'll take a few away.
Bruce, who is your local councillor?
Local council is... Okay, I may not be able to name the people. That's fair. I think the point, though, is that firstly, I'm not a voter. I probably don't really know. But secondly, it's just the local council is made up of individuals within the area, right? I think that's the point at which we do have more accountability. I think the point that they ignore is that like ministers themselves don't have accountability under their side. That's the thing that just fundamentally have to contend with. They literally lose accountability. Okay, why is there a large harm for Māori people and communities? Contextually, note there's only so much land to collect resources in New Zealand, right? We're just a geographically small country. There's probably either indigenous land or there's protected like conservation land. I think the point at which we're like getting from indigenous land that's really damaging. So why are they going to be harmed for Māori? 3 reasons. First, there's significant capacity for these ministers to disregard Te Tiriti, right? That is to say, there's a point at which they're just less able to get appeals on their side of the house. It means they're able to blatantly disregard these concepts. It means that they're able to just go and do a lot of bad harms to Māori without actually getting accountable. Second, there's less connection with local iwi, right? I already explained how the local council is probably made up of individuals from within the Māori community. It means that we probably have more accountability that way. Third is that they're probably going to prioritize the climate over Māori accountability. That's really important. Okay, 2 harms on this first. First, this is a really big principal harm, right? Noting that they have the capacity to disregard the fundamental document for Māori communities, noting that they can't express distaste on their side of the house. I think that principal harm that means that they're more disenfranchised than they claim on us. But second is that they break the sense of identity for Māori people, right? That is to say that these people's identity are literally tied to their land. The point at which they can come here and disregard that and go and destroy their land, I think that's the point at which we fundamentally harm these individuals. For all those reasons, I'm very proud to oppose.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the second speaker of the affirming team.
Came up today in righteous indignation and told us that Shane Jones is what we need to defend today because he can't adequately defend Maui. He seems to forget the fact that Shane Jones is Maui, and actually, you know what? I am happy to defend that burden. 2 things to do in this speech today. First, on the clashes. Second, a split on how we uniquely increase business confidence and investment in general. But okay, first off, on the clashes. First, we need to actually look at councils in general as an actor. What has a negative told us? In general, they've told us that because local councils have the word local in them, they are more likely to take into account everything that is important to these people. 3 things that we've already told you. First, on demographics. The council itself, I will prove this to you a bit later. The council itself is disproportionately likely to be old. It is disproportionately likely to be white and also based in farmers. Why is this? Because the voting base of people who take part in local council elections are the people who are the most motivated and the people who have the most time to vote. Who are these people? It is people who are retired already, who are quite old, who have the time to care about this kind of thing, to care about this ballot what's coming through your door in general. Secondly then, also a lack of accountability for local elections. What does this look like? This looks like a lack of ads and awareness in general for when local elections happen. That means we have just huge amounts of voter apathy, right? Because in the last Auckland Council elections, I remember vividly the actual turnout being like lower than 50%. That is honestly embarrassing. That is not enough for them to claim accountability from. What this means then is it magnifies the first mechanism that I gave you. What this actually means is that local councils, even though they have local in the name, are actually insulated from their local communities. They don't always have the interests of their local communities in mind. Thirdly then, we told you on a lack, just like a revenue and resources level, we got no response. Local councils, like en masse, are going skint to the extent that they can't even pay for their own water treatment systems. What this means then is they simply don't really have the capacity to do this anymore. They don't really have the capacity to hire bureaucrats to do this kind of thing for them. We solve this uniquely because the comparative is the government, the most well-funded government body in New Zealand. And note that like efficiency and quality is proportional to resources. We've already told you why that is. Then the actor of the cabinet. First, just note, this kind of thing is at the PM's discretion. We're happy for the Environment Minister to sit in and be one of these three people who like takes part in this decision. I think this just frames a lot of their stuff out of this debate. Four things then. First, on media attention. Three things to note here. This body, simply on our side of the House, has more name recognition. Note that Bruce could not tell you who his local councillor is and who is making this decision for his local area. We tell you that these people also have more power and it's more exciting and engaging when the media talks about them. What this means then is if Simeon Brown really is the devil that they want to portray him as, what the next headline is Simeon Brown destroys the environment. He has an active incentive not to do that. Note furthermore then, on the status quo, it is the Thames Coromandel Local Council that just approved a huge new mining contract. That is something they need to deal with and actually explain to them. Second, I told you on the level of accountability, general elections, actually people care about them. What this means is less apathy, more voter turnout. We get more accountability on our side of the House because these people can be held to more account. Because and for all of those reasons that I told you, local election turnout is profoundly white, old, retired, and farming. Thirdly, we then tell you on experts and resources, this is really just a flirt. We note that the local councils have been going skint. We say that on our side of the House, the government, because they're the government, because they have so much money, because there's so much prestige associated with working for them, means that they can just pull from the best and brightest in this country, and guess what? It's pretty hard to say no to the government. Furtherly, we tell you that we just enforce similar standards nationwide, right? Instead of Auckland Council having a different standard from Wellington Council, which has a different standard to the Queenstown Local Council, we get similar standards nationwide that is good in and of itself because we can have a national strategy about how we do these things in the long term that is a unique good to our side of the House. Fourthly then, we tell you that the central government is directly answerable to the Waitangi Tribunal and other organs of accountability. They are the crown, the buck stops here. I think this just directly responds to Bruce's material about local councils are good because they're local. Within this then, there is a subclass about representation. And I think the only myth that they really give us here is because local councils are local, they are more inclined to care about local issues. Three things to note here already, just on a frame level. We told you Shane Jones is Maori. I think they're defeating their own case with the examples that they give. Secondly, we're happy to let the Minister for the Environment to sit in on these meetings. And note that we have many, many more government bureaucrats than just 3 ministers doing the government's job for them. 3 additional things to note then. On resources, I've already told you about accountability furthermore then. Labour ministers, we tell you, can't afford to lose tangata whenua support. They are actively likely to actually give a damn. Secondly, we tell you that the Nats can't afford to slip even further into the abyss of not caring about Maori people. We think that they have an image to protect. We think that they have this reputation they want to uphold. Thirdly, then we also tell you that there is special representation for Maori in the form of Maori seats. We also tell you that there is an active incentive for the government to bump tangata whenua people up into leadership roles, to be visible and to make decisions for this government and to be the next decision makers of tomorrow. At the end of the day, Even if we believe the need best case and say that decisions are made with slightly less regard to local populations on our side of the house, we can still win on the other metric, which is speed. I'm going to tell you why this is super, super duper important. Just in a moment, I'll take a point.
The government currently has been voted in by individuals who literally are trying to disenfranchise Māori people. How do you get accountability?
And yet Shane Jones sits in the highest organs of government in this power in this country. I don't think that this is true, actually. Okay, speed and efficacy as like a metric. We've told you why there is no trade-off between time and quality, time taken and quality of decision. We think we can win on Meg's turf already, and so in all the Megs that we just gave them. Why is time also enough to win alone? Four things here. First, we tell you that environmental effects are immediate. Because burning coal in Huntly is already poisoning the people there. It's just already increasing the rates of lung cancer of the people there. We tell you that like mining in the Coromandel is doing the same. Secondly, we tell you that it's just inevitable in a long-term metric because climate change will kill us all eventually. Thirdly, we tell you employment. This is a shot in the arm of the local economy. And fourthly, we tell you that this is the moral duty of the government to do this kind of thing because if they haven't, they have failed as a moral entity. Okay, split then. The context is New Zealand is a country where it is very hard to get anything done and build anything, and we have a reputation for doing that. Two things then. First, we send a message to local New Zealand construction companies about how New Zealand construction is that we're happy to support you by like not clogging you up with so much bureaucracy. Secondly, then we send a message to international firms, and because like New Zealand is now an easier place to do their thing. Why do we care about this thing? Mainly the snowball effect. Every time a foreign investor comes into this country with more money to do their thing, that's just more money with which we can build dams, that is more money with which we can build wind turbines. I think that is a good in and of itself. So proud to be the side that is actually defending the environment.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to welcome up the second speaker of the negating team.
I'm so glad I've made this debate about incentives rather than a weighing debate, because all the material is reliant on people in the community caring about environmental harms, less than the people that are actually in that community being directly affected by that. So, a couple things in this speech. Firstly, I'm going to be talking about the incentives on governments. Then I'm going to integrate my split as to why the political incentives on governments are bad for local communities. Secondly, I'm going to talk about local communities, why they're comparatively better. Thirdly, I'm going to be talking about the impacts weighing them against each other. So, firstly, on political incentives. Here I'm going to do my split as to why the political incentives on governments are bad. There are two main reasons for this. Firstly, lobbying. Lobbying from these companies trying to do these renewable energy projects. Why do they prioritize this over professional advice? This is because jobs in the economy are oftentimes the most important things in elections. People not being able to afford the luxuries and people not being able to, that make their lives lifer, people having constant financial stress that keeps them up at night on whether or not they're going to pay the rent, that exists every time you buy an item, is something that's an incredibly big harm to people, and therefore it's the most, and therefore they prioritize these companies and their advice over environmental advice from like ministers or like experts that they want to talk about. The comparative is that local aren't because the local council doesn't decide the economy, right? These are people that just do nice things for your community. They aren't the ones that implementing wide scale economic policy that leads to more jobs being created, people being economically better off. Secondly, is that they are incredibly short-termists. This is because election cycles. This is because of doing like 4-year election cycles, which mean that they want to just get into that next election cycle, and know that they can't guarantee that they're going to be in parliament in the next 20 years because there is a unique political climate that put you in right now. The unique political climate of Labour and COVID and all of the economic council of that is why National is in right now. So you can't guarantee you're going to have that same political climate later. So therefore, you just prioritize the next election and capitalizing on what you have right now. And note here why is it that you're likely to prioritize the short-term people right now, right? So I think there are a lot of people that just prioritize the economy over the environment, and this a lot of people. These are Nat supporters. I think this is relatively intuitive. There's a large voter base for these people out there. But even those that care about the environment have lots of climate anxiety due to Cyclone Gabriel existing previously. So that means that, and oftentimes renewable energy is seen as just the main way to solve climate change. It's the easiest way to understand. It's the thing that's oftentimes most pushed in the media. So therefore, they prioritize solving climate change over harms like deforestation due to how approximate the harms of climate change are to people right now and how much people care about that. So on both sides of the political spectrum, people aren't prioritizing local communities and the harms of that. Note then that the comparative is that local care about these immediate environmental harms, the ones that affect them, because these are the things that actually affect them. So even if there are bad, disastrous environmental harms that could result in backlash, that's going to be later down the line, and they care more about getting into the next election cycle. I explained to you why they're able to get into the next election cycle through this, not prioritizing these local communities. They then said, there's going to be backlash that occurs to them. I have two responses to this. Firstly, a lot of people just generally don't care about Māori issues or issues to local communities because it's not actually approximate to them. It doesn't actually affect them in their day-to-day lives. Comparatively, people probably care far more about renewable energy, getting that out there because it's often seen as a way to solve climate change. Secondly, even if they do, Māori people are disadvantaged. They don't have the financial or political power to seize media attention. Comparatively, companies have PR firms, they have connections to journalists, which means that if you get in a battle of fighting in the media and your public relations, what that means is that companies are far more likely to come out on top, and that these local communities and Māori people are far more likely to be deprioritized. Then said, wow, the Māori seats like this, guys, this is only out of a couple hundred people within Parliament. Obviously, this is not a good way to hold them accountable. Look at how the current government right now is oftentimes just constantly talking about how constantly trying to disregard Te or Waitangi. Obviously, these aren't a good way to hold people accountable. Moving on to local councils, there are three reasons to why local councils are good. Firstly, is that the harms are much more approximate to you, and local people vote you out if you do those harms. They said, well, you don't vote in these elections. I have two responses to this. Firstly, the harms are approximate to you, so you probably really care enough to go out and vote. But secondly, the people that vote, the small amount of people that Alan talked about, are the ones that know about these harms. They're the ones that directly care about these things, not just random farmers that, apparently just don't care about the local harms. It's the people that are the most informed, and therefore these are the ones that are likely to go ahead and vote on environmental issues. The second reason as to why local councils are good is that they probably just care, right? These aren't people sitting in an ivory political tower. These aren't the CEO of Air New Zealand. These are probably people that are just more. These are probably people that far more just actually care about their local community, have actually interacted with them, don't have an express preference to go into big, large politics, which means that they probably talk to local iwi, they probably talk to local people in the community and just actually care about those things. Further, read the info slide. This says that they have to consider Maori and environmental impacts. This is not necessarily about a debate of incentives, these are strict regulations that are put on them from the RMA. So that means then you can so even if there were bad incentives, those didn't matter because of the regulations that were on them. They then said, well, local councils have a lot less capacity. I have two responses to this. Firstly, governments can just give them all the resources they have. If they have connections to schools, have connections to good people, local councils can just hit them up and say, hey, can I have some of that? Secondly, is that they found this burden than the government. Governments have multiple voting issues. Some random wind farm isn't going to decide an election. Oftentimes they don't prioritize, prioritize getting through perfect legislation around this, prioritize accessing all those materials. Comparatively, local councils do, because this can definitely be a thing that decides whether or not your local council is in the next election. They then said, well, there are lots of white regions out there. I have two responses. Firstly, they're Maori regions. White regions aren't where the treaty violations are occurring, so they're probably not going to be that important this debate. But secondly, white people still care about environmental harms, right? So if your environment is going to be harmed, white people still have an incentive to care about that. They then said, well, we need standardization. Incredibly unclear as to why standardization doesn't occur on our side. The RMA presumably has guidelines as outlined in the info slide, so the RMA still applies. Before I move, so at the end of this, obviously local councils have better incentives than governments, which means that local councils are going to make better decisions. Before I move on to impacts and weighing, I'll take that.
On lobbying, given that there is less of a media spotlight on local councils, why wouldn't you, as a lobbyist, run a private council?
Well, okay. There's this media attention. Yeah, but what I explained in my speech is that even if there's this media attention, the people, it doesn't matter, right, if not everyone goes out to vote, because the ones that go out to vote are the ones that care about the environmental harms, as I outlined to you. So now then, moving on to the impacts. So they have said climate change is bad. I have two main responses. Firstly, not really New Zealand. These are very small emissions. It's all the other countries that are doing the big globe emitting the big emissions that lead to climate change. They then said they're really only their analysis as to why this matters is like international relations. Why would they randomly care about New Zealand, a country that's doing like zero carbon emissions? Like why would they do anything other than just yell at them a bit? Incredibly unclear as to why that matters. Note if this comes out in third app, that's new material, so you shouldn't credit that. They then said, well, local environmental harms, there are local environmental harms from fossil fuels, but obviously, the RMA can prevent these kind of harms. Meanwhile, if you remove the RMA for, the harms from renewable energy sources to the environment, that means that's like, obviously leads to a lot of harms there. And here I just want to talk about why the environmental harms are so bad. Because if the environmental harms weren't small, this move wouldn't operate. Because know what it looked like before? It probably looks like, Maori people being ignored due to that heavy colonization stage. And, pass a policy that, promotes bureaucracy, promotes minorities being prioritized over the majorities. That takes a lot of political capital. So Maori people had an express preference to fight for this over other things and spend a lot of political capital on it. That just intuitively shows this is an incredibly important thing. You should weigh that far more within the efficiency, which they gave really any analysis for.
I thank the speaker for their speech and would like to invite up the third speaker of the affirming team.
New Zealand as a country has like 90% of their power created by renewable resources. I think that globally a lot of other countries probably care, right? A lot of other countries now have the capacity to switch their systems to more renewable systems insofar as this country is actually doing anything. 3 things to do in this speech. Firstly, let's talk about whether or not the short-term benefit is justified. Let's take NEG at their best and then weigh that against the short-term benefit. Secondly, we'll talk about local versus cabinet ministers, and then thirdly, I'll split and tell you why that's particularly salient in today's debate. Firstly then, let's talk about the short-term benefit. Note that no matter what happens in this debate, we get to claim the fact that you just get faster reform, and reform is far more to actually create these renewable resources, it's far more likely to actually happen. This is particularly important because even at NEG's best, if you don't believe that the council and the local government have much differences, we can still win off of this point. Why then is speed particularly important? 3 things to note. Firstly, building more dams and building more more hydroelectric dams means that a greater percentage of electricity is renewable. And note that this is particularly important because oil resources aren't something that's going to last forever. You need to consider the long-term impacts within this debate because that has incredible implications that I'll talk about. I'll stand on later. Secondly, then on just long-term infrastructure, I think when you have the capacity to switch to renewable resources quicker and easier within the long term, because note that switching to renewable resources is going to be inevitable on either side of the house. We just get far more innovation. We get the capacity to actually transition to this. Thirdly, then we can actually protect from this change because we know that this is happening. We can have that preemptive shift. Note that was unlikely to happen under the status quo. Note that Matthew literally told you that within the last 10 years there has not been any large change that's happening. All of the problems with local councils means that they probably won't let this pass anyways. Even if they do, it's far slower. Okay, look, I think what the impacts are is that you just need to buy that we just have more efficient renewable resources, but that also we just have generally more of them. You need to believe that in long term, oil runs out and those kinds of things will be slower, so we need to transition. We need to believe that the shift from currently using more oil to a world where you mostly use renewable resources happens far more efficiently insofar as for a greater period of time you've been using that anyways. You also have, if you believe this, you probably need to opt into the fact that you just get less CO2 and less oil spills within the ocean. I think these are particularly issues that are really really important for particularly people who are rural and particularly people who are the most vulnerable, because they're the ones who have to look out into their backyards and see the fact that there is a huge oil spill in their local lakes. They're the ones who have to probably drink that water that is contaminated. They're the ones who have to deal with the fact that their power grids aren't that good because they live in a rural community that doesn't get all the benefits that us Aucklanders usually get. I think generally what also happens is that in the long term you probably need to burn up more oil because you have the necessity to use that electricity. But notice that this transition is far more likely to get cheaper because you've been using it for longer, because it has the capacity to be innovative, to be more efficient. NEG needs to contend with this. Third NEG is too late to contend with the payoff that they get for the most vulnerable people who have to deal with these issues. Also note that in the short term we still went out because you get increased employment. This was never dealt with down the line. I think this is also particularly important because these are people who are working on these dams. These are these are contractors who are actually getting paid actual money to work in these jobs. Also, just in the short term, you also get less oil spills. You also just generally get less pollution. People are this is something that affects the majority of people. Also, just you get far more buy-in to the movement insofar as your average person now believes that the environmental movement has the capacity to do anything. They can see a new hydroelectric dam being built. They're far more likely to think, oh yes, the New Zealand environmental movement is actually doing something. I'm far more likely to then vote for things in the future that are better. The way up is that climate change affects every single person in this country. Oil, the transition from renewable to non-renewable to renewable resources affects absolutely everyone in this country, and particularly the most vulnerable, those who have access to the least resources. If you're weighing off likelihood, this is something that is inevitable. This is something that is so incredibly likely to happen. You need to opt into this. Note then also, you just get far bigger foreign investment, which is a point which is Alan Smith has never actually dealt with. I'll whip this more later. Then, the only thing that Bruce has about this entire environmental clash is the fact that he just tells you that, we care about the fact that we're mining things in the short term. I think even if you take Bruce at his best and you believe all of that, you need to weigh this against the long term. The long term fact that for the next 50 years, people have to deal with far less developed infrastructure. But also a couple things to do with talk about that mining. Firstly, you don't necessarily need that many minerals to build a hydroelectric dam, right? You don't need to mine literally all of the resources in this country to get that dam. It was far less. It wasn't to the extent that Bruce wished you to believe. Secondly, that more mining in that local council meant that the local council is far more likely to get away with things because of all of the insulation that was brought to you down the line. It was never fully dealt with. I think even at our worst, we get more infrastructure that has flow-on effects to the climate future. If you buy the likelihood that the status quo is not enough due to the lack of councils doing anything, you must side with affirming. Secondly, then, let's talk about local cabinet ministers. Note that this is important because the NEG's entire positive case hinges on the cabinet being far, far worse than local government. I think firstly, if you believe that these are quite similar, you need to weigh that with the first clash. But also, secondly, let's talk about why the local government is far worse. We told you a few things down the line, but 4 things to say under this. Firstly, that the local government had incredibly low voting turnout, which meant that you didn't have the capacity to actually care, because the people who were turning up were particularly ones who had, firstly, the time to care about this, but also, secondly, the monetary capacity to actually go and show up to those elections or actually care about this. These are oftentimes individuals who are white and privileged and ones who don't necessarily care. Comparatively, when you have MPs that the people in cabinet have to actually deal with the Māori MPs that were voted in by the dual election system in their day-to-day lives when they're in parliament. This means they're far more likely to care about these issues, but also, secondly, under that, note that they're the ones who are actually listening to Māori who are actually listening to Māori scholars when they talk and asking them questions about the land use and all those other kinds of things. I think also just generally on both sides of the house, the government can't just go doing absolutely terrible things to minorities, but also that then Jamie told us that short-termism meant that the government gets significantly worse. I think you're far more likely to be short-termist when you don't have a huge voting populace when you're a local government. You don't have the capacity to do those kinds of things. I think I'll tell you what now.
Local councils are legally obliged to care about how collecting resources will impact the environment.
Look. They are legally obliged, but all they can do is it's far more likely that they're going to do what Matthew told you at first, it was never actually dealt with. They're going to publish a piece of a report that says, oh yeah, we considered building this hydroelectric dam, but we actually didn't. Or, oh yes, it was totally okay for us to build this hydroelectric dam and displace a Māori community from their iwi because of all of the other benefits. Notice that they don't get that much media scrutiny insofar as they are a smaller government that is more insulated from public scrutiny. That is just far worse. Let's then talk about Alan Split and why this is particularly important and increases our margin in this debate. I think foreign investment and just the capacity to give individuals more jobs insofar as you're building more infrastructure is something that you should particularly care about in this debate panel, because it's literally people's lives who are on the ground. It's people who need that money to in New Zealand there's a currently like unemployment crisis. I think insofar as you can get more employment opportunities for individuals on a large scale, because you just generally have a lot of infrastructure being built. In those instances, these people's lives just get far better. These are actual jobs. This is the actual New Zealand economy. Side negating can't contend with all of this at third name.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Now, to close out the substantive portion of today's debate, I invite the third speaker of the negating team to the floor.
It's ironic that third Av comes up and says that if anything that I say should be disregarded, when she literally brings up more impacting than first and second Av give us combined. That's the basis on which I think we win this debate. 3 things I'm going to do in my speech. First, I'm going to explain why Alan's split literally does not matter in the context of this debate. Second, I'm going to explain to you why environmental concerns at best are symmetric on their side and at worst are literally so much worse. And finally, why they generally harm Indigenous communities more and why that's really bad. Top of my speech, I already mentioned in my introduction that side affirmative literally gave us no impacting. What that means is that even if any of their mechanisms are true, that literally does not matter because no one actually knows what happens from that. I think that's a critical flaw that they made in their case. Note that at the end of this debate. Second, note that Jamie gave you plenty of stuff on why governments will perform worse just due to lobbying. Note that there was insufficient response from Av on that front. Governments are generally quite a poor actor. I'll talk more a bit about that in my speech. First, on Alan's split. What he told us was that there was going to be more FDI and that there was going to be more jobs. First of all, New Zealand is good at other stuff that isn't just building things. New Zealand has other industries that people can get employed to. And note that these industries are not super high skilled. Sometimes it's just about going into a factory and packaging some dairy products. Second of all, other countries are significantly better at renewable energy. I don't think that a lot of foreign companies have an incentive to invest in New Zealand at the point at which New Zealand's renewable energy isn't exclusively good compared to other nations. They're more likely to just put foreign direct investment there. I don't think they actually get an increase in jobs. So what have I proven? I've proven to you why literally Alan's split literally does not have any change on their side and why there is literally going to be no increase in foreign direct investment. The impact of this is that they don't get more jobs for people that Rena impacted so much about people on the ground, but also just the fact that they don't get any exclusive monetary benefits. At the end of it, they literally cannot weaponize the split and try to weigh it so heavily because they don't even get any impact from that, given that the mechanisms don't stand, given that they don't get any benefits on that front. I'll take a POI now.
Why do you think turnout on the last Auckland Council election was so low?
So great, I'm about to go into that. Okay, next, just on environment. first thing that they told us was that, first thing, they told us that they were happy to have the environmental minister be a part of like the 3 ministers that are like making these decisions. Okay, first they can't just assert that. They need to give us actual reasons as to why that was the case. They failed to do that down the line. But why is this not likely? Note that this like fast track bill does not just apply to environmental technologies. On a broad scale, it actually applies to a lot of different, it applies to a lot of different it applies to a lot of different infrastructure projects, more diverse projects. It means that there isn't an exclusive incentive for the environmental minister to be there. If given that they haven't proven any plausibility, they can't just assert that. Next, just on voter apathy, right? I think that voter apathy doesn't even matter at the end of this debate. Note that regardless, I think scrutiny is a really big thing, given that it comes from your literal communities being like, you're racist for not supporting our like most vulnerable indigenous communities, when it comes from you're literally destroying the environment that we live on. I think also, given that they do, if these local councils do bad things, I think that's going to decrease voter apathy because the issues that they're creating are literally issues that are so proximate and so impactful to the people in these communities. Next, on resources. I literally don't think resources matter at the end of this debate either. Note that you don't need that many resources in order to be able to read a bill and say yes or no. I think that they can't claim exclusive massive benefits on the resource front. On scholars, I'll bring you more material on that later. Next, on accountability. Not that I think there's going to be less accountability on side affirmative. Why is this? First of all, the 3 ministers that are literally making these decisions are 3 ministers that are that their voter base does not care about the environment. They do not care about indigenous communities, as I'll explain later, and they are very pro-economy. Note that means that the voter base doesn't care, and they're not going to hold these ministers accountable because this voter base literally could not care less. That means that they have the capacity to do a lot of bad things for the environment. They're able to shut down important projects. They're able to put forth projects that are environmentally damaging in order to support random economic endeavors. Note that on the comparative, on our side we do have more accountability. Why is this? Note that if they try to implement wind farms in a really lovely forest that people really like, they're more likely to be upset about that and hold their local councils accountable. That's a unique benefit that needed to be contested with throughout this debate. I don't think there was sufficient response on that front. Okay. Next, on the fact that they're trying to give us this whole metric of urgency. Note that I don't think this is important for 3 main reasons. First of all, New Zealand does have quite a lot of renewable energy compared to a lot of nations. We do use significantly less fossil fuels. We do use a lot more hydroelectric dams and wind farms. Second, and compared to the rest of the world, New Zealand is really small in terms of the carbon emissions that it actually produces. That means that the impact that New Zealand creates isn't going to be that severe. It means that there's not that much of an incentive. It's not that important for them to implement immediate change because it's not going to do anything in the grand scheme of things. But third of all, the issues, the impacts that the environmental movement has are generally not that proximate to New Zealand. That is, that New Zealand is typically not impacted by other islands sinking. That means that voter bases are less likely to even, that means that it's just not that important. Note that people still perceive climate change as urgent. There's a difference between perception and whether it's actually urgent or not. 4 reasons. First of all, there's online fear-mongering. Second of all, voters care because they want to care about their future communities. Third, politicians prioritize short-term election cycles and just, building another wind farm is an easy way for them to get back into parliament. And fourth, there's a lot of panic just because of environmental situations that have happened in the past. Right, weigh that against what Bruce told you about how our material is significantly more logically prior. Okay, what have I proven to you at the end of this point? I've proven to you why the environment at their best is symmetric, and why at the worst the environment actually actively gets worse. The impact of this is that firstly, there's going to be more wasted resources, that is land, and also resources used to make, a wind turbine, and also just the fact that in the long term we might see even quicker advancement of climate change, which is obviously something that's really bad because it impacts so many people it impacts literally so many people. What this means at the end of this debate is we can literally win on this material because this is literally all the material that AF tried to push to us. This was their main positive case. Given that the positive case doesn't stand anymore, I don't think that they can win. Next, on indigenous communities. The first thing that they told us was that that there's going to be loads of scholars and that's why that's a unique benefit. 3 reasons why I think scholars are worse than iwi who are actually in the local councils. First of all, scholars tend to be more disconnected from a lot of local iwi's problems. That is, that if you spend loads of time, doing a degree in indigenous studies, it means that you're less likely to actually understand the issues that they experience because you're only looking at it from an academic lens. Second, there's going to be less nuance. Note that Māori culture is not just one-dimensional. There's a lot of different Māori tribes that have a lot of different perspectives, and that usually is dependent on where they are. This is dependent on local issues. Scholars can't just account for every single one of those. But third, a lot of the people who actually do learn about indigenous studies are typically not always going to be Māori. There might be some Pākehā how who is also trying to represent the voices of Māori. Next, just on how Shane Jones is Māori, I don't see why this matters because he literally overtly does not like Māori people. If Av thinks that's what's empowering to Indigenous communities, I would really push them to reevaluate their perspectives. Next, just on how local councils find loopholes. Here are reasons why I don't think that's true. First, they are held accountable by iwi. We told you why iwi are going to be a part of these councils all the way, like at Bruce and at Jamie. This was never sufficiently responded to for this to not to be true, so it stands at the end of this debate. But second, they're also held accountable by locals. That is the fact that locals are generally see that people in Indigenous communities as more humanized since they're more proximate to them. That means that they care about these people more, and if they care about them more, then they're more likely to hold these local councils accountable in order to make sure that they're not doing bad things to people that they actually care about. Next, what have I proven to you at the end of this point? I've proven to you why this is actively worse for Indigenous communities. That means that we're further disenfranchising a group that has already been so historically disenfranchised by the government that disenfranchises them. And that means that at the end of this debate, this is a path to victory in and of itself on vulnerable and deaf. I am so proud to negate it.
I thank the speaker for their speech. Now, for reasons lost to time, it is ancient debating tradition to flip the speaking order, so I would like to invite the reply speaker for the negating team to the floor.
Given that side affirmative necessarily supports a policy that means that they get less accountability, that means that all of the power to distribute these materials are given to 3 ministers that expressly, as it stands, literally hate the environment, literally hate Indigenous people in this country, I think it's very hard for them to claim that they get environmental benefits. It's very hard for them to claim that they get accountability for Māori people. I'm very proud to affirm, or to negate. There are 2 things I want to talk about. First is about environmental impacts on both sides of the house. 2 things on the list. First is about the effects on climate change. The affirmative push was twofold. First is that there is an immediate requirement to have more renewable energy in this world, and second is that renewable energy is very important because greenhouse gases are really bad for the environment. We gave you 2 responses, however. First is that New Zealand already uses a lot of renewable energy. It means that it's probably not that big of a deal if we have marginally less energy infrastructure right now. But secondly is that New Zealand is a very low emitter on a global stage. That is to say that honestly, climate change isn't going to be impacted by that much if New Zealand switches to renewable energy sources. I think it's difficult for them to claim that we get really large benefits, the point at which firstly we already have this infrastructure, just having extra wind farms probably isn't going to do too much on their side of the house. But even if you do believe that New Zealand does need climate infrastructure, I think we still win this debate insofar as we're able to prove that there are significantly more different harms to be able on their side of the house. Note then, this brings me to the second point on this clash, about why more regulation leads to a better environment, right? Note that this is about the lack of environmental accountability that exists on their side of the house. Alan claims that there are environmental issues that impact a lot of local communities. Note then that we explained to you how these environmental issues are likely to get significantly worse on their side of the house. This looks like how mining with less oversight probably pollutes water streams significantly more. That's something we told you in first that they weren't able to engage with down the line. I think the point at which there's less oversight overall is the point at which the environmental impacts happen significantly worse on their side. So, how do we weigh this point? Firstly, there's about significantly more immediate impacts for people on the ground. That means individuals actively have less clean drinking water. I think that's the point at which the severity of harm that impacts literally everybody within that community really matters. But secondly, on a global stage, note then that we told you that there isn't that big of a deal in terms of urgency for them to happen, for them to have this climate tech. That is, we're happy to trade off having an extra 2 years for this infrastructure to be able to come out, if it means that we actually have more safer, immediate environments for individuals to live in. But even if you don't believe in that we win this environmental point, what do we have next? About the accountability for Māori communities. Note then that currently, local councils are legally obliged to care about Māori communities when they distribute resources. That's something that they explicitly don't care about on their side of the house. I think it's unfair for them to come up and tell us about how there's Indigenous seats, for example, or how Shane Jones is Māori. Honestly, that doesn't